Good morning, and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, CEO and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, who is Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss the outcome of the informal gathering of EU leaders last week and ask, did it meet its declared objective to provide new momentum for European competitiveness? And we're also going to take a look at what happened at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. As always, totally interactive session. I have some questions for Janis and Fabian. If you have any questions, either click on the Q&A button and write your question, or click on the raised hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes. As always, my only request is that your questions are brief. Let's crack straight on because we have a lot to discuss. And Janis, tell us what it is we have to discuss. Why was this retreat, as it was called, called? What was the aim of the meeting, and what did they actually focus on?
Well, it was conceptualized as a strategic brainstorming, informal strategic brainstorming on Europe's competitiveness. The idea is to build a more competitive and resilient economy, to quote Costa, and to use this meeting, the informal retreat of last week, in preparation of the March European Council, and I would also add of the June European Council, as it seems, in order to prepare a better coordination among EU leaders at the top level, and to better prepare for what is going to be then concretely on the table. In terms of the agenda, they discussed all the issues that will now have to be brought forward in a Commission proposals related to the simplification agenda, to the completion of the single market, one market as we now call it, energy-related issues, the protection of strategic industry, the reduction of dependencies, issues related to trade, and overall the question of how to invest into Europe's economy, whether you have severe differences between even core members, especially between Paris and Berlin, but not only on this issue. So it was a big agenda, trying to find more agreement on the basis of a very changed geopolitical and geoeconomic situation. The question is whether the change, which you can also sense in the overall attitude, and you also sensed it at the Munich Security Conference, will actually lead to the results which are required. That is still a big question mark, which I'm sure we will be discussing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And Fabian, Antonio Costa said beforehand that he wanted this informal brainstorming to provide the same political impulse to competitiveness at last year's meeting did to a Europe of defence. We can discuss the degree to which the rhetoric of a Europe of defence has been turned into reality, but I don't want to focus so much on that today, but more, he said afterwards, it had brought new energy and a shared sense of urgency. And Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, who was hosting the meeting, said this was a call to arms, and many leaders underlining that new geopolitical and geoeconomic reality. But how significant do you think this meeting was? Did it really mark a crossroads, a real new momentum for competitiveness?
We don't know. The key will, as always, be in the delivery. And the big question, which I think will always remain, is yes, we have these statements of intent. We have reports by former Italian prime ministers. We have lots of rhetoric about urgency, about having to do things, doing things which we might not have done in the past. But then the question is, are we actually going to do it? And I would very much start from competitiveness already as a priority. I thought we had said all of this when we had the Draghi report, when we had the Letta report, when we had the beginning of the mandate. It was in every commissioner's mandate. So we are reiterating that it's urgent, that it's important, that we have to do more, that it has to be more decisive. But in the end, these are words. The question is, what are we going to do?
Indeed. I'd also like to ask you whether you think the areas they particularly focused on are the right ones. But before we do that, Janis, you alluded to divisions between member states. I was quite struck when you look at what Costa said after the meeting. Of course, there are no council conclusions because it wasn't a formal council, but he used various formulations to describe levels of agreement among member states. He talked about there being unanimous agreement on simplification, on trade, on accelerating the savings investment union. Then he talked about EU leaders accepting the challenge on the single market. Then he moved to a broadly shared understanding about protecting and reinforcing certain strategic economic sectors, and even looser still, broad agreement on the issue of European preference. So I'm wondering, am I reading too much into these various formulations, or was this really an attempt to mask some very serious divisions, and I think you alluded to, particularly between French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz?
Let me first add something to what Fabian was saying, because you can really sense that there is a different vibe. There seems to be a different sense of urgency when it comes to this situation. Mats was saying 2, 3 years ago, we would probably not have had a discussion similar to the one we have today. That was a quote. And he's correct. We did not have a similar discussion. We did not understand of how big the urgency was, and already was strong after 22, if you look into the geopolitical situation, but also when it comes to geopolitics. We've been seeing the worsening of the situation over the past years. So we lost valuable time. The question is whether we will actually do what it is necessary. You also made a reference, Jacki, to the informal retreat on defense last year. I would argue, yes, there has been progress, but the progress we've achieved is by still not at the level of what we should have been achieved at the European level. Now, when it comes to issues of European competitiveness, I think the way in which President Costa put it, I think, was a bit too optimistic. I think there really is unanimity or unanimous support when it comes to simplification agenda. But also here, there are differences between member states in terms of how far to go, and also differences among the EU institutions. The European Parliament is much more critical, but also among EU leaders. I'm not sure that there is a full 100% unanimous position on this. When it comes to trade, which was another point, yes, there is unanimity when it comes to the need for open trade, for more trade agreements. But look what happened with Mercosur in the European Parliament. There are also differences between member states. In France, there is a different position when it comes to Mercosur than it is in the Nordic countries, and I could go on. So even on trade, there are big differences. And if you go into more detail, savings and investment union, capital markets union, there are huge differences between member states. We're even discussing whether we will need enhanced cooperation in that area, because there is by far not a unanimity. On energy, we have major differences in terms of some fundamental questions. I'm sure we're going to discuss about that in future. Also, when it comes to the creation of European champions. Made with Europe is another.
Yeah.
So there are big differences among member states. And when it comes to the financing question, where there is a question of how much investment there is needed annually into strengthening Europe's competitiveness. Draghi says 800 billion annually. The French president says 1,200 billion annually. And there's a question of how this will be financed beyond private money by a savings and investment union. How the EU budget will be used, and obviously there won't be enough. So do we need more? So you have a plethora of questions where there is a big differences between member states.
Indeed. And Fabian, when you look at the speeches that EU leaders made at the Industrial Summit in Antwerp ahead of the informal retreat, Merz's speech was all about simplification, cutting red tape, cutting bureaucracy. Emmanuel Macron's speech was much more about issues like, you referred there to the Made in Europe concept, European preferences, common debt, diversification, are very different emphases. And then Bart de Wever came up with, actually said, let us not copy another man's stupidity when he was talking about Made in Europe. He said, I prefer the phrase Made with Europe, suggesting a much more open approach rather than closing off and Made in Europe. I mean, these are huge differences. Common debt, another one where I know you wrote a paper very recently saying the MFF is the wrong answer to the right question. And one of the things you were talking about was common debt. We're still not anywhere near getting agreement on that, are we?
We're not anywhere near getting agreement, but it's paradoxical because, in some sense, we're already doing it. And I think this is part of the world we're living in now, that actually getting consensus is almost impossible now. So we are looking at what are alternative methods. We've already mentioned enhanced cooperation, essentially coalitions of the willing doing things. But even for that, you need the willing. You need a group of countries which are going to say, yes, we are willing to make a European compromise, which is what this always has to come back to. You always have to get to a point where you say, yes, we're giving up something, but we have something greater which we create with that. And there's very little willingness to do that. What leaders are generally doing is they're performing for their domestic audience. They're trying to tell, in this case, their own industry, I'm fighting for your cause. I'm going to deliver for you. The German Chancellor is saying simplification is what you are worried most about. It's a big political topic in Germany as well. So he's emphasizing that. Macron is emphasizing that the public money which will be raised will stay within the countries which are paying for it. These are understandable political priorities for these leaders, but in the end, they will have to come together for a compromise. And this is the bit where we have in the past not managed to actually find what is the path through which delivers something to everybody, but doesn't deliver everything to everybody.
Can I just follow up on that, Fabian? Because you said for coalitions of the willing, you need the willing. There is a lot of talk post this informal retreat about signs that we are moving towards a multi-speed Europe. Suggestions on, Emmanuel Macron was saying if we don't get consensus on key issues by June, a smaller group of member states maybe should forge ahead on their own. Let's use reinforced cooperation, enhanced cooperation, call it what you will. Are you suggesting here that it would be quite, when it comes to the crunch, actually quite hard to find those smaller groups that really are willing to advance? And more generally, how do you see this discussion? Are we now inevitably bound on whether you call it coalitions of the willing, whether you call it multi-speed Europe? And of course, the former includes non-EU countries normally, the latter not. But how do you read all of this?
Well, we first have to look at what are the technical possibilities of doing this because it's not straightforward. When we're talking about competitiveness, we are inevitably in areas which touch on the single market, which touch on the multi-annual financial framework. So areas which affect all member states, not only a coalition of some kind. And that means it's technically not easy to construct something where you can go ahead using the instruments, using the organization of the European Union to progress. But politically, I think the problem still remains. Yes, you might have a group which is more keen on going forward, but that does not mean that within that group there are not political priorities, barriers, that there are not painful trade-offs you're going to have to make. And in the end, this is what all action which is decisive actually entails. You have to make painful trade-offs. You have to say, what is it I'm willing to give up so that we can create something different, something new. And there, I think it's easy to say, yes, we share the common goal. But when it then comes to the detail, are you going to be able to sell that into your domestic political environment? And that's, I think, where in the past we've seen that not only were they not able to sell it, they were often not willing to sell it. They were not willing to try to see whether they could get a majority at home. So maybe that has changed, but I would have to say that unfortunately our track record is not particularly good on that.
Mm-hmm. Janis, would you echo that? How do you see the challenge of applying this in practice? I mean, is this a significant moment for the conversation about a multi-speed Europe? It rears its head from time to time. It's been called all sorts of different things in the past, variable geometry, etc., etc. Is this the moment where we really start to see it begin to be applied? But would you also share Fabian's question mark? Okay, they might agree in principle, let's go down that road, but it's still not going to deliver.
No, I agree with Fabian's question mark. But what I said earlier, there seems to be a different mood in the room. Um, to quote Ursula von der Leyen, often we move forward with the speed of the slowest. Exactly. This is what we did. We often move forward, or not at all forward, because we did had member states who were opposing and others who were hiding behind those who were opposing. So we need to think of how we're going to deal with the lack of unity at the price of ambition. And that is something which we have been highlighting for a long time. So the best way is always to do it within the EU framework with everyone on board. But if that option is not possible, one needs to look for alternative options. And here the second best option is to do it on the basis of instruments provided by the EU treaties, by the Lisbon treaties, and that's enhanced cooperation. It is important to remind ourselves that also that was used in the context of the 90 billion for Ukraine, because there was a situation where you had EU 27 minus X with a small x, who were opposed, and we used this instrument of enhanced cooperation. Now we're talking potentially of a group of at least 9 member states, because this is what enhanced cooperation requires, at least 9 member states. So it's a big X which would not be participating. And that raises even more questions with respect to how to use enhanced cooperation, as Fabian was alluding to, when it comes to issues of competitiveness related to the single market and so forth. And if all that is not possible, and that's what also we have been advocating and arguing, then potentially that is required to happen outside of the EU treaties. Now, what we know from the history of the non-application of enhanced cooperation, because enhanced cooperation is an instrument which is actually not really often used, or only in very small cases. So the 90 billion Ukraine was the biggest case we've been using it thus far. It was used as an instrument of pressure, to put pressure on others to agree to some form of a compromise. And I think that that's also the case this time around, that they're using it as a pressure instrument on others. But that really requires, echoing what Fabian said, that you have that group of willing member states who credibly can argue that they're ready to progress. And there are big question marks whether you
you
have
point
these
there
groups
to,
of the
yeah,
willing.
you point there to you need 9 member states, and it doesn't appear, you mentioned earlier Savings Investment Union as an area where this might be applied. There is a group called the E6, they call themselves, that meet informally ahead of finance ministers, and particularly focusing on this issue. But that's only 6 countries. And they haven't tabled any formal proposals. So real questions about how this would work in practice. And also Yoga Braga in our audience saying Germany and Italy are probably the most protectionist countries in the EU on services. How can they push for more competitiveness? Will they have big difficulties internally because of this? And this, I think, Fabian, points to your point about domestic audiences. How do you sell this to a domestic audience? And there the question you're asking particularly about Germany and Italy.
Yes, well, now let's be frank. I think that most people, and especially the wider public, is not aware of the discussion we're having. So the question is, how are you selling it politically? And that, I think, where you can see a big difference, because there is the link between the hugely different geopolitical situation, thanks mostly to Donald Trump and the public debate, and the geoeconomic concerns which many people have because of the increasing competition from countries like China, for example. So the overall mood is being prepared in order to move forward. The question is whether there will be enough leadership to do so. But if the French and the German, plus the other 3 in the group of 6, would agree on something, that already would give a huge push in the right direction. But are these countries really ready to do that push? As the question alluded from Jorge with respect to France and Italy, to Germany and Italy, there are huge question marks. The differences between the French and the German are very strong. So will all this now lead to a push of the so-called willing within the EU to move things forward? There are still doubts, but I think the overall political climate and the communication, which we're seeing also in Munich, by the way, because geopolitics and geoeconomics can no longer be separated from each other, is a different one than it was
Okay.
4 or 6 weeks ago.
So we come back, Fabian, to your central point about how willing, basically, and does the rhetoric translate into reality? Do you believe that if we get to June and we are making no progress on some of these key issues, this is, albeit slowly, becoming an idea whose time is coming, and that people might become more willing in the face of the scale of the challenge, which becomes more evident with every passing month?
So the whether you mean competitiveness as the idea which time has come, or the idea of coalitions of the willing, I
Both.
think on competitiveness, I do start to wonder whether we didn't go down the wrong route with Draghi. Not because of the content of Draghi, but because it is so much. And maybe we just need to focus on 4 or 5 concrete areas where we're going to say, this is what we are going to do first, and this is what has priority. But what we need to see now, and I hope this is going to happen rather quickly, is rather than a statement of intent, whether by 6, by 9, or by however many countries, that we actually see a concrete proposal. That we see this is what it would actually mean. So we can start talking about how do you get that through the system, what are the legal challenges, etc.
Can I just ask, who does the proposal, is it the same as the Commission has the right of initiative on EU legislation? Is it the same for enhanced cooperation? Would it have to start with a proposal from the Commission?
I think practically it has to start with a
Yeah.
proposal
Yes.
from the Commission. I think, of course, the member states could put something into the ring, but to put that together into some form of formal proposal, it needs to be the
Yeah.
Commission
Yes,
that does it.
yes.
Yeah.
It clearly, the rules apply, the general rules, it's embedded in the EU treaties. The general rules apply also to enhanced cooperation. It's a smaller group of
Yeah.
countries. There are certain rules that need to be adhered to, which are clearly specified, by the
Yeah.
way, in the EU treaties. And by the way, that's interesting. If it is an area where there's unanimity, there's also unanimity among the countries who are participating in enhanced cooperation. So if you structurally
Okay.
would look at this would also be an opportunity to insert more qualitative or super qualified majority voting via the route of enhanced cooperation if the member states among themselves who participate in enhanced cooperation agree to do so. So you could also use that in order to push in terms of governance reform. I know
Mm.
this is very complicated, but there are ways how you can exploit this in a more general way.
Indeed, this underlines the point you made, Fabian, about how this isn't easy. This is complicated
Yeah.
and has to be done. But as you say, we're not even really seeing the signs of the member states throwing something into the ring that the Commission would have to act on. Not yet.
Yeah, and then I think what is also important that when we look at this on a political level, actually, the resonance of this has been surprisingly low. There's been very little reaction in the member states.
Mm.
And I think it shows that in the end, yes, we have these discussions, we have these statements of intent, but you have to be more concrete. You have to actually show what does that mean in practice. And that's where we are still falling down. On coalitions of the willing, they are here to stay. I mean, this is something we have seen also in other policy areas. What is different to the past? Of course, we always had a multi-speed Europe, but what is different is it's much more variable now. We're talking about in some areas, including countries which are not even in the European Union. We are talking about different coalitions for different policy areas. We are not talking about this idea of countries going ahead and then others will follow inevitably. So it's a very different beast, but we need to make it work. And this is the bit where still In many areas, we are still at the level of intent rather than actually putting things on the table which make a difference. And especially in competitiveness, we have talked about it for a very long time. We have known about the difficulties. There is no reason why we didn't go ahead. I don't know how many times we have emphasized that the single market is our greatest asset, but we need to do more to do X, Y, Z to make it work better. This is a mantra which is repeated every time we talk about competitiveness, which has been for decades. But in the end, are we actually delivering? Some of us might remember things like the single market programs where we tried to do this, but it wasn't very decisive. And what this moment talks about is really making decisive progress, and that will only be possible with a smaller group of member states.
Indeed.
But whether they deliver is a big question.
Okay, I want to come to what is going to happen in terms of the March Council, what we're expecting on the single market and other issues. But Stacey Featherstone in our audience, I'm not going to read the whole question out because it's quite long, but in thrust, it is basically talking about the simplification agenda is retroactive. It's looking at what we already have and looking at what can be got rid of. But she says, meanwhile, far too little attention is paid to the regulatory pipeline, which is rife with new rules. Do you think that the actual EU setup is to blame for the competitiveness deficit? How can simplification be forward-looking rather than only retrospective? Who wants to pick up on that?
I'm happy
Fabian.
to. I think we have gone down a bit of a blind alley by focusing very much on EU simplification, the red tape, as people have put it, without thinking about what is the broader picture. Because the broader picture is that while we are saying, yes, there are some rules which we don't need anymore at the European level, at the same time, we are deciding that many more things will have to be done at the European level. So how do we square that circle? Because doing more things at the European level is usually associated with also new sets of rules. The EU, or whatever kind of construct we are creating for this, has to have the legal competence to act in certain areas. It has to, if we have a capital markets union, for example, we will need a set of rules at the European level, which defines what is actually in that, what are the rules of engagement, etc. So there is a paradox here, which we are not going to solve by having omnibuses on XYZ. It's not in itself a bad thing if it is done well, but it doesn't answer the overall question. And the overall question is really about, I would argue that we need to find ways of replacing 27 rules with one rule, and one rule which then always counts, which is enforced, which is implemented, which also creates certainty for businesses, but also for other actors. But that's politically a much more difficult thing to do. It's much harder to actually say, and we have seen some ideas of having a common European rule book for companies, etc. Having that delivered again is one of those on the long list of things we have talked about for decades, and we've always failed to get there. So I think we need to rethink what competitiveness actually means, and we need a much more proactive agenda. We need to start thinking about how do we get the investment into new policy areas, new technologies, into areas which will bring us back to a point where Europe is inherently competitive, because we've lost a lot of ground.
Okay. Janis, please do react to that, but also just in terms of what we can now expect in March. We've mentioned the single market, and to use the Letta phrase, one market for one Europe. I thought that's what we were always supposed to have had. Question, what do we expect in concrete terms? We mentioned the energy transition, we've mentioned the Savings Investment Union, but what are we expecting the Commission to put on the table in a month's time? And indeed then at the June Council?
Yeah. I'll respond to this, but let me add 2 points to what Fabian mentioned, adding. So I'm echoing what he said, but adding 2 elements. One is it's interesting to witness that there is a pushback coming from the Commission to the argument that Brussels is over bureaucratizing, that there's a need for simplification. Yes, we are there. That's what the Commission argues. We are ready to do that. We're ready to do, and I'm quoting, a deep house cleaning of the acquis. But there's also gold plating, meaning that member states add more rules to when they implement decisions which have been taken collectively at the European level. And that's true. You have different ways in which member states implement, and many of the ways in which they do it add more bureaucracy. So to blame only Brussels, which by the way means also the involvement of member states, so it's not Brussels dictating, it's being decisions being taken at the European level, but it's also decisions which are being taken at the national level,
Yeah.
which add to that.
Yeah.
So that's one element, the gold plating, which there's a pushback. And there's also this idea of when there is new regulation which are being put in place, that's an old phrase which has been used and done not always in the right way, to introduce sunset clauses in order to make sure that whatever new is being decided might at some point be discontinued or might be changed in the course of time. Now, with respect to what to expect in March, well, first of all, the Commission will come forward with a set of proposals. The One Europe, One Market Roadmap and Action Plan, as von der Leyen or the Commission have called it, which will include timelines, targets, and time limits. That's what we're being told. And it will be based on 5 building blocks. One, no surprise, the simplification agenda. That's where it always starts. Then building the so-called one market, so that what we have been saying, completing of the single market in the past. Then a special emphasis on the energy market, which will be a separate building block, and then elements related to digital and trade. So simplification, building one market, one energy market, digital, and trade. These are the 5 building blocks where proposals will be brought forward. But the question is, what kind of proposals will we see? How far will they go? And will they include also element among related to the most contentious issues between member states? And that relates especially when it comes to money.
Mm. Thank you very much. Fabian, from your perspective, if these new single market proposals are to really make a difference, what do they need to include?
I think we have to rethink the single market. It's very difficult to argue that at the European level because we are very much wedded to the single market as the big idea, the big asset the European Union has. But in the current world, it's not working in the way it should. We have to recognize that how we created the single market was really determined by the environment in which we were operating. And the environment doesn't exist anymore. And we're coming to Munich in a second. Very clearly, the driving force behind that at this moment in time is the Trump administration. But that should mean that we rethink the single market, that we look at not only the rules within the single market, but how do we apply these? How do we defend the single market? The whole trade defense idea, the whole idea of having now effectively, and I'm not going to hide this. I think we are talking about when we're talking about these coalitions of the willing in areas like capital markets union. We're talking about a different single market because when we're looking at the basis of the single market, it's free movement of capital. Now we are taking one part of that and we're putting that aside. We are going to put aside a number of things in the defense area. So it's a very different single market we are talking about, and I would hope that there's a recognition that we have to rethink some of the basics, including, for example, a common industrial policy, which I know is even more politically
Can I
contentious than a capital markets union.
Thank you. I want to come on to energy in a minute with you, Janis, but can I just get your take, Fabian? When we talk about, and Costa talked before the meeting about a more assertive approach to economic security, this debate about made in Europe, or as Bart de Wever said, because he was saying we still need to remain open, he talked about, no, I prefer to talk about made with Europe. And Macron putting a lot of emphasis on a percentage of European content, and so on. How do you see that debate playing out? And is made in Europe an essential part of a more assertive approach to economic security? Just would like to get your take on that.
If you had asked me in the past, how will this work out, then I would have said most probably we will find some kind of compromise. We will have an element of made in Europe, but it will be defined in such a way that it's not too burdensome, basically finding a compromise which everyone can live with. The question is, are countries politically willing to find that kind of compromise anymore, or do they fear that they cannot sell the compromise at home? But in the end, I think we are in danger again of losing sight of the bigger picture. What we should be thinking about here is what is it we actually need to do? And that's where we also need to look at different areas where I think the need to act is greater. Are we talking about defense and security, where we have to look at how are we going to replace some of the capabilities of the US? Are we talking about capital markets, where also, interestingly enough, we're not having a discussion about how we integrate the UK into this, even though it economically makes a lot of sense to have that discussion. So we are making progress, we are moving forward, but as I've said in the past, this is still in the area of the progress illusion.
Indeed.
We're not moving fast enough, we're not moving at the scale or at the scope which we need.
Sure. And you mentioned the UK. Interesting to see as a sidebar to this, now the debate in the UK and some of the words Sir Keir Starmer is using, British Prime Minister, about moving closer to the single market, a real fear that made in Europe may exclude us. It's been focused on the defence issue largely until now, but a real sense of what does this mean for the UK outside of the single market. But Janis, can I come to you? Because we need to move on. I want to move on to Munich shortly. But on the energy transition, Costa said afterwards, and I quote, we need pragmatic solutions that take account of specific challenges of member states and some industrial sectors. What should we read into that? What was he actually saying? I mean, this is clearly a nod to those who think the EU has been trying to go too far, too fast. But how does that translate into what happens next? I think Janis may have frozen. It looks to me like he has. Fabian, can you pick up on that while we try to get Janis back?
Yeah, sure. I think energy clearly is one of the areas where we need to make progress, where we have seen enormous changes over the last years, not least with Russia's aggressive actions, which we still have to take into account. But we have not been able to jump over our shadow when it comes to energy, because we still have in the end, the energy generation, how you choose to generate energy is in the treaties as down to the member states. And that's where we always have this discussion, where the institutions also have to emphasize that how the member states do that is still down to they themselves. And clearly at this time, for example, we've had a very aggressive, if you like, expansion of nuclear being announced in France. France very much betting on nuclear in the long term, whereas we have other countries which are completely opposed to nuclear, which are not going to go down this route. So we have these differences fundamentally about how we deal with energy. On top of that, clearly there's that geopolitical element, the geoeconomic geopolitical element, which also raises the question of what is going to happen with Russia in the longer term. Do we have countries which are thinking about having a resumption of gas or a continuation with Russia. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, but in the end, uh, it is an area which is absolutely fundamental. But just also referring back to the competitiveness question, whatever way we choose to generate energy in Europe, we are far more expensive when it comes to energy prices
Indeed.
than any of our competitors. And at the moment, I do not see any real pathway of addressing that, either in policy or in the economic thinking behind this.
Thank you. Janis, you froze
Yes.
briefly for a while. Good to have you back. So I turned to Fabian to ask him, in terms of the energy transition, what would you add? And what do we actually expect concretely to be on the table in terms of those pragmatic solutions that Costa was talking about? Would it be at the March European Council or at June? And what is likely to be? Is there something new that we can expect?
Well, first of all, I think sorry that I lost my connection. First of all, I think what we can expect is that the Commission will come forward with its proposal in March. Decisions will be taken the earliest in June. So this is the time frame where we're discussing, while they're saying we need to already implement things in 26, 27, 28. So in terms of the time frame they're putting themselves on, it is very specific, and it is actually taken, knowing how long things take at the European level, it is rather ambitious. That's why I think the general approach will be very selective. I think what we will be seeing that in the different areas, including in energy, but also when it comes to the one market, we will have a focus on very concrete things where there seems to be a realistic the chance that there will be an agreement. And even in those areas, that it might require enhanced cooperation. So it's the 28th regime, EU Inc., as we now call it, the Saving and Investments Union, um, potentially the reform of merger guidelines. So these are things related to the one market. And when it comes to energy market, I think it's about strengthening infrastructure. So we're going to see push with respect to the grids package, the idea of having, again, all this is not new, European energy
Okay.
highways, and then the questions related to the market design of how you are determining the prices. All this is rather technical, but I think those are the areas where there is a belief that at least in some areas compromise can be found among the 27, or enhanced cooperation would be the way in order to move forward. So you would have enough member states agreeing to that.
Thank
So I
you.
think it will be very selective.
Very selective. Fabian, you wanted to come in very briefly, if you would, and could I ask you to say also very briefly 2 words about this review of the merger guidelines to allow what they're calling a certain degree of company consolidation in certain strategic sectors to allow for the emergence of true European champions. How different, how significant is this review of the merger guidelines? Briefly, if you would, sorry, because I have a question I want to put to you from Paul Taylor, and then I want to move to Munich.
Um, just very briefly, I think one of the things we really have to watch out for is that we don't just do announcements. I think what we are seeing more and more at the European level is this tendency to have a big announcement, but then there's very little behind it. And at best, it then takes a lot of time, a lot of work to have something concrete. We need concrete proposals on this, not more announcements, more declarations. We need to see something on paper which you can engage with, where you can start also the horse trading, which is inevitable when you come to this. So that's something I think which also clashes with Janis's timeline, because I think a number of these things are really going to be kicked in the long grass. So what was your second question?
No, in terms of, let's bring in Paul Taylor's question here, because he says, and this goes back to our discussion about the coalition of the willing, how credible is Macron's call threat for a coalition of willing countries to go ahead with a package of reform, including Eurobonds, by June, if there is no general agreement? Do you believe he can get Germany on board with this? So, June is round the corner in EU terms. How credible is this threat? Who would like to pick up on that? Fabian, perhaps continue with you, and then Janis, I'll come back to you as we move to Munich.
I don't see in the current political constellation that Merz is able to sell this at home, especially not in his own party, which I think is going to be very much opposed to the idea of Eurobonds. But it is a paradox because, in a way, and I would suspect the same applies to the Chancellery, we all know it's going to have to come. We all know that the fiscal space at the national level is such that we are not going to be able to borrow the money we need for a number of different areas. And that applies even to Germany, where people still have illusions about how much fiscal space they have. So we are going to have some form of Eurobonds. I would pretty much be certain that we don't call them Eurobonds, because nobody wants to be tainted with that political discussion. But in the end, we are going to have more common borrowing, but we are going to do it very badly. We are going to only do it when we have our back against the wall, when there's no other option on the table, as we saw before Christmas. And we are not going to think through how do we deal with free riders, for example. How do we involve countries which are outside the European Union, but we might want to have inside some of these instruments.
Right.
So we're going to rush it through at the moment of crisis, but then we are going to do it badly.
But it is inevitable. Janis, a quick one, if you would.
Adding to December of last year, where we reached the agreement on the 90 billion, let's remember what happened in 2020. There was a severe push on the German government at the time, which led at the end of the day to Next Generation EU. Berlin was put under pressure, under real pressure. Now, let's take into equation that we have presidential elections in 27 in France. That is putting a lot of pressure because there is the danger that from then onwards you might not be able to do certain things.
Yeah.
So if Fabian is right, there's an inevitability of doing certain things. There is a political pressure moment that you can generate. And by the way, Matt says we cannot go for, and we will not be ready to go for Eurobonds. But he's also talking about the fact in his broader narrative that we're living in a new world. That we cannot compare the where we now live in to where we were living 4 weeks ago, 6 months ago. And he links it to Trump most predominantly. So that I think can be used in Germany, but it will be very selective. It will not be optimal. It will be limited. It will not go as far as what Draghi has been telling us, which means that at the end of the day, the different mindset with both Draghi but also Letta have been calling on us and on EU leaders to change and have a different mindset when it comes to how to approach. I think that new mindset we will not see. So it will be a forging of compromises here and there, which will be suboptimal, but it's better than not doing anything at all.
Okay. We don't have time to go into this, but as Radu Mihail has put 3 questions related to this, Fabian, I'll quickly throw at you. He is talking about whether there is a discussion of differences in productivity between European enterprises and, for example, US enterprises, which he puts down to differences in the level of the quality of management. And he says, would the Made in Europe concept include the promotion of European management value, or indeed to address this? I suppose broadly the question is, are we looking at this question of competitiveness in this broader way, or with a fairly narrow focus on issues relating to the single market and so on that we've been talking about? Very briefly, if you would, and then we're coming to Munich.
Competitiveness is a really complicated concept. It's very hard to pin down. Productivity in many ways is an easier concept. It's easier to measure. It's easier to actually say what it is. But what we actually have seen is that Europe has been falling behind. in many cases because of structural long-term reasons, which are not going to be fixed by a European Council. We're talking about, for example, how far Europe is behind on certain technologies, which are becoming extremely important now in terms of economic performance. So in the end, we have to also have a much wider discussion, which where we have to be much more honest about where the shortcomings of Europe are and what we have not been doing, because in many ways we've been resting on our laurels. And we've been caught out by a significant shift in the global economy, which we have not followed.
Thank you. Let us move on to Munich. And Janis, let me come to you. There was much concern ahead of the Munich Security Conference after last year's explosive performance by J.D. Vance about whether this conference could be used to, at the very least, de-escalate tensions between the EU and US. Now, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, US Secretary of State, made a speech which some have said, he was reaffirming the transatlantic relationship. This was a good speech. This puts us back on a more even keel. Others said, no, fundamentally, he was saying the same thing as J.D. Vance. He just said it nicely. Namely, yes, the transatlantic alliance is important, but if you do it our way, if you mirror yourself in our image, otherwise we go it alone. What was your reading of the speech and the reaction from EU leaders to it? Was anybody, sorry, I'm going to be cynical here and I'll display my colours. Was anyone fooled by it, particularly in light of the fact that his very first thing he did after that was go to visit Slovakia and Hungary? Interesting choice of member states, one could say. Your reading of the speech and the reaction to it?
I'll reveal myself immediately. I'm in the second camp. I think, yes, it was a different tone. There was, you could also sense it by looking and watching the audience reacting to the speech. There was this feeling of relief that it was different to what they had heard 1 year earlier by J.D. Vance. But in terms of the concrete content, it was the same logic, and it follows the logic of the national security strategy. So let's be frank in terms of what it actually means. And I think that also policymakers after the speech were also sending the signal, do not now think that this is a different US. It's the same US. And also the way how this is being done, it's how you think in the logic of Trump's doing deals. So one is playing the more difficult one, the other one is trying to be more relaxing. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump comes and takes over and says something about certain things which will create uncertainty anyway. So I think we need to put things into perspective. And by the way, let's also not forget that in the speech, and you mentioned that he afterwards went to Hungary and Slovakia, he's always mentioned Europe. He was not talking about the European Union. The European Union is still something that is there to be undermined. It is not. That's the perspective of Trump. It's not in the interest of the U.S. So the signal by then going to Bratislava and to Budapest is we are supporting those governments who want to hollow out the EU from within. Yeah. That is, I think, the message we need to take away from also this year's Munich speech of a high-level representative.
And is that the message you think? Were EU leaders fooled, or did they see it the way you see it?
No, I don't think. Well, some leaders are having the same opinion, and some feel very close to what Donald Trump is saying, and they feel that he is their advocate, and they're hoping that he will help them. But I think the rest, I don't think that they're being fooled by this. The question mark for me is whether, even if they're not fooled, and that goes back to the discussion we had earlier, they will actually do what is needed at the European level, both when it comes to the geopolitical and the geoeconomic challenges, which you cannot divide from each other. You need to think these things together, and whether they will be ready to do what is necessary in order to strengthen.
I want to come back to that in a moment. Yeah.
To strengthen European power. And that I'm not sure of. But I don't think that anyone of the ones who are smart enough to understand what happened on Saturday and what was conveyed during the speech were fooled by the speech.
But indeed, but when we've talked so much, Fabian, about the divisions between member states on issues and the lack of agreement on a common approach, let alone the detail of some of these issues, it could be used as a pretext to say, we don't need to worry as much as we thought we needed to worry last week, if I can put it very oversimplistically. Are you concerned that even if they don't really buy it, it could be enough to take away that sense of urgency in Europe?
Well, I think firstly, we also need to be clear that yes, it sounded a bit different. But when you look at the context, when you look at the meeting with other leaders, the agenda which is behind this is a cultural war. It is about destroying our form of democracy, our form of European integration. That is even more clear for me than it was with Vance because it comes now in a more measured way. But it's still, the message is exactly the same as it was. And it is what was in the national security strategy. It is about also this idea that migration, climate, the kind of things Europeans have failed on in the light, in the eyes of Trump, that we're continuing to fail on, and that there's only some of our leaders which are performing better, namely the ones who are following Trump's example.
Yeah.
So I think what we are seeing here is a reaffirming of that division of that these are not our allies. These are actually the enemies of what we have created here. But whether our leaders will really act on this, I have my doubts,
Okay, so let me
because that
ask
will
you.
be
Yeah.
extremely costly to do, both in money terms, but also in political terms.
Okay, so let me ask you, Antonio Costa, come back to where we started. He said at his post-summit press conference, let me be clear, in 2026, Europe will deliver. Janis, you started by saying that there has undoubtedly been a change of attitude, but will it deliver the results required? And Fabian, you said, are we really going to do it? If EU leaders, what will you be looking for? What would be the biggest sign for you that finally that gap, the progress illusion that you've called it in the past, that gap between the rhetoric about what we need to do and the willingness to actually do it, however painful, however costly, Fabian, you said, extremely costly. What do you think the biggest sign would be that EU leaders actually mean it, whether it is next month at the March Council or by June? What do they need to do to really make 2026 the year of delivery? 1.5 minutes each, I'm afraid. Fabian and then Janis will have the last word.
Um, I don't think it matters so much what it is precisely. I think there are many things which need to be done. I think from my perspective, what we really need to see is that things are getting done, that we are not talking about them, but that we're actually moving forward. And it's interesting, we're seeing that things are also moving at the global level. We shouldn't forget this is a much broader issue. So, are we going to find a way of working with Canada, working with other countries to create something which really addresses some of the geopolitical problems? Are we going to finally have a proposal for the Capital Markets Union, which we then can get through the system? Are we going to have these coalitions of the willing on different topics, which can deliver? Are we going to do more on Ukraine? We should not forget that that's there. So ultimately, we need to deliver in many different areas, but delivering on some would be a good start.
Thank you. Janis, final thought.
First of all, delivery will not stop if at all it happens in 26. We're talking about a longer term process, so it needs stamina. And I think it is the question for me is whether pro-European liberal democratic forces and leaders in Europe will be ready to go for it, whether they will be really pushing for reforms within the EU, among all, in certain groups of member states, inside or outside the EU framework, when it comes to geopolitical realities which we're facing, geoeconomic realities we're facing, also that they become not only concrete when it comes to those two issues and the things we have been discussing today, but also when it comes to enlargement, which is something which is extremely significant, and whether they will actually be ready to enlarge the EU rather quickly, including Ukraine, but also others, and whether they will actually be tackling the thing which they need to start tackling, which is the reform of EU governance. That's the thing which they do not want to do, where they think it's not necessary. But I think that the reality shows that it is necessary. And that, by the way, is also included in the Draghi report. Governance is included. And that's things they want to avoid. If they continue to avoid the difficult things, then they actually won't be able to deliver.
And we will come back to these issues at our next EPC update after the formal European Council in March, and I'm sure in many updates to come. But thank you for today. Just to flag up a few EPC publications relating to the issues we've been discussing. One entitled Leaders Retreat, EU. The EU needs to escape velocity to close the tech gap with the US and China. From firefighting to strategy, how the EU's new economic security doctrine can deliver. And that paper I mentioned from Fabian, that to the point from Fabian, the MFF is the wrong answer to the right question. There's also a compilation, if you're interested to look more into what happened in Munich and the run-up to Munich, a series of background papers which have been compiled, relevant EPC papers related to the issues they were discussing. And there was also an encapsulation by EPC experts of what they hoped would come out of the retreat. You might want to compare that with what actually did come out. But thank you very much. On the event side, some events coming up very clearly related to what we've been talking about. On February the 23rd, an EPC Thought Leadership Forum with General Sean Clancy, Chair of the EU Military Committee. And on March the 5th, EPC Thought Leadership Forum with Tuomas Hendrik Ilves, former President of Estonia. And as I said, we'll be back immediately after the next European Council to discuss the outcome. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, gentlemen, and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.